Have you ever felt the world shift beneath your feet in a single devastating phone call? Imagine your life, a picture of perfect comfort and security, suddenly fracturing, sending you tumbling into a reality you never could have foreseen. For Daisy, that nightmare began on a gloomy afternoon, and it led her down a path far more unsettling than just losing her home. The rain was a relentless curtain against the kitchen window, mirroring the gloom that had been gathering in my own heart all day. Dark clouds, heavy and bruised-looking, had clamped down on the California sky since morning, a somber prelude to the storm brewing in our lives, though I didn't know it yet. Mom hummed softly to herself as she stirred a pot on the stove, the comforting aroma of her vegetable soup, a family staple filling the cozy space. It was a familiar ritual, this pre-dinner calm, waiting for Dad to return from his day navigating the often turbulent waters of real estate. We were a portrait of suburban contentment, my family. Daisy, I am or was at 18, blissfully unaware of the precariousness of our seemingly solid world. Our house, nestled in a quiet tree-lined neighborhood, was spacious and filled with light, a testament to my father's success. We never wanted for anything, our pantry always full, our worries seemingly as distant as the muddy fields of my father's rural hometown, a place I barely remembered. My father, Mark, was a man built of solid brick, his appearance as rugged as the California coastline, tan skin etched with the lines of a life lived outdoors, a constant reassuring presence. Courage, that was Dad's defining trait. He faced every challenge head-on, or so I believed. My mother, Sarah, was the gentle counterpoint to his strength, a teacher by profession and by nature. Kindness radiated from her like warmth from the stove, a constant, nurturing force in our lives. Life in our spacious house had flowed with the predictable rhythm of the seasons, peaceful and secure, until that day. That day, destined to become a jagged scar in the smooth fabric of our family history. The kitchen, usually a haven of warmth and laughter, felt charged with an unspoken tension, even before the phone rang. Maybe it was the oppressive weather, maybe it was some subtle shift in my mother's usual cheerfulness that I hadn't fully registered until later. But something was undeniably off-kilter. The sudden shrill ring of the landline phone sliced through the gentle hum of the kitchen, a jarring intrusion into our carefully constructed tranquility. Everything seemed to pause, suspended in that brief, echoing sound. Mom's humming stopped, her hand froze mid-stir, and my own breath hitched in my throat. It was Dad's ringtone, a jaunty little melody that suddenly sounded discordant and ominous. Mom reached for the receiver with a practiced ease, a slight frown creasing her forehead. "Mark? Honey, you're home early," she said, her voice laced with a question. I watched her face, a canvas of subtle emotions, shifting almost imperceptibly as she listened. Her brow furrowed deeper, her lips pressed together in a thin line, and the hand not holding the phone clenched into a tight fist at her side. The gentle kindness that usually softened her features seemed to drain away, replaced by a growing apprehension. I stood motionless, rooted to the spot beside the counter, suddenly unable to breathe, my senses hyper-alert. The aroma of the soup, moments ago so comforting, now felt cloying, almost suffocating. The cozy warmth of the kitchen seemed to evaporate, leaving me chilled to the bone. Time stretched and warped, each second expanding into an eternity as I waited, suspended in the agonizing silence of Mom's one-sided conversation. Then it happened. The transformation. In mere minutes, everything fractured. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in disbelief, a silent gasp escaping her lips. The color leached from her face, leaving her skin pale and ashen. Her shoulders began to tremble, a delicate tremor that quickly escalated into a full-body shudder. The phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering against the countertop, the jaunty ringtone dying abruptly, leaving an even more profound silence in its wake. "Daisy," she whispered, her voice barely audible, choked with unshed tears. She turned to me, her eyes wide and haunted, reflecting the storm that had just broken over our lives. It's your father." My blood ran cold. Dad. What could possibly be wrong with Dad? He was invincible, wasn't he? Strong, courageous, impervious to disaster. The thought that anything could shatter his carefully constructed world, and ours along with it, was unthinkable. "What is it, Mom? What happened?" I asked, my voice trembling, mirroring her own. Fear, sharp and icy, pierced through my initial shock, gripping my heart in a vice. She swallowed hard, trying to regain control, but her voice still wavered precariously. His company. It's gone bankrupt, Daisy. Bankrupt. Everything all gone. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. A single word capable of dismantling our entire reality. Bankrupt. It was a word I'd heard in news reports, read in books, but it had always seemed abstract, distant, something that happened to other people, not to us, not to my strong, capable father. No, I breathed, shaking my head, refusing to comprehend. No, that's not possible. Dad is. He said there's nothing left, Daisy, Mom interrupted, her voice cracking. No money. He has to sell the house. To pay the debts. Sell the house. Our house. The spacious house filled with sunlight and laughter. The only home I had ever known. The place where every memory of my childhood was anchored. Every birthday party. Every Christmas morning. Every quiet evening spent curled up on the sofa with Mom and Dad. Gone. Just like that. Sold off to strangers to settle debts I didn't understand. Debts that had apparently swallowed my father's entire world. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping for breath. Thunderstruck. That was the only way I could describe it. Like a thunderbolt had ripped through the cozy kitchen, shattering everything familiar, everything safe. I stared at Mom, my vision blurring with tears that threatened to spill over. Her face was a mask of devastation. Yet even through her own shock, she was trying to be strong for me. I could see the raw fear churning in her eyes, the desperate attempt to maintain composure. But the worry was undeniable, etched deep into the lines around her mouth and eyes. Tomorrow, she continued, her voice barely a whisper, echoing Dad's instructions from the phone call. Tomorrow you and I have to move. Back to the countryside. The countryside. Dad's hometown. A place that existed only on the periphery of my memory. A distant, faded photograph in the album of our family history. My grandmother had passed away years ago, and my grandfather, her father, had lived alone in their old family home ever since. Visits had been rare, infrequent pilgrimages for holidays, quickly forgotten once we returned to our comfortable city life. My memories of Grandpa were hazy, fragmented images of a kind, gentle old man with twinkling eyes and a warm smile. A grandfather from a storybook. He used to joke with me, shower me with candy, and call me his little treasure. But it had been years. Years since I'd truly seen him, truly remembered his face, his voice. Move back to the countryside? I repeated, my voice flat, numb. To Grandpa's. Mom nodded, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the kitchen window. Her eyes filled with a mixture of despair and resignation. Your father said we have to go live with your grandfather. At least we'll have a roof over our heads there. Roof over our heads. Sounded so stark, so reduced. From a spacious house in a leafy suburb to just a roof. The descent was dizzying, terrifying. My father's words echoed in my mind, heavy with fatigue and defeat, painting a bleak picture of our immediate future. The next morning dawned gray and cheerless, as if the sky itself was mourning our loss. We moved like automatons, Mom and I, packing our lives into cardboard boxes, a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the organized chaos of moving into a new home. Every item we packed, every photograph carefully wrapped, every familiar object placed in a box, felt like another piece of our former life being sealed away, becoming a relic of a past that was already fading. Dad was gone. He had disappeared after that devastating phone call, swallowed by the storm he had unleashed. No goodbye, no explanations, just a phone call and then absence. It was as if he couldn't bear to face us, to witness the wreckage of his failure reflected in our eyes. Or perhaps he was simply gone, consumed by his own despair, leaving Mom and me to navigate this sudden, brutal upheaval alone. Just Mom and me. We crammed into our small, practical sedan, a stark contrast to the spacious SUVs that populated our old neighborhood, the car laden with boxes and suitcases, overflowing with the remnants of our lives. As we drove, the familiar cityscape of California, the bright, high-rise buildings, the bustling streets, gradually gave way to a different landscape. The smooth asphalt of the highway morphed into cracked, uneven roads, then narrow, muddy dirt tracks. Towering skyscrapers dissolved into endless fields, stretching out in desolate silence under the overcast sky. The scenery outside the car window became a mirror of my inner landscape. Desolate, silent, heavy. A profound sense of loss settled over me. A weight in my chest that seemed to grow heavier with every mile we traveled further away from our old life. The vibrant colors of the city faded, replaced by the muted browns and greens of the countryside. A world that felt both alien and strangely familiar, like a forgotten dream slowly resurfacing. Finally, after what felt like an endless journey, the old house appeared before us, a weathered sentinel at the end of a long rutted driveway. Discolored roof tiles, peeling walls revealing the aged, faded bricks beneath, a testament to time and neglect. A large, overgrown garden surrounded it, fruit trees, once meticulously pruned and cared for, now sprawling wildly, their branches heavy with unharvested fruit, a picture of forgotten abundance. Hesitancy snagged at my feet as I stepped out of the car. A strange reluctance to approach this wild and unfamiliar scene. This was it. This was our new reality. This dilapidated house, this overgrown garden, this isolation. It felt a million miles away from the spacious comfort of our suburban home, from the bustling energy of the city. As if summoned by our arrival, a creak echoed from the house, the sound of old wood protesting against movement. Slowly, the heavy main door swung inward, revealing a figure framed in the shadowed doorway. My grandfather. He emerged into the dim light filtering through the overcast sky, a thin, slightly hunched figure, his silver hair wispy and thinning. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, etched with the passage of time and a life lived largely in solitude. His eyes, deep-set and shadowed, seemed older, more profound than my fragmented memories recalled. Then he smiled. A slow, hesitant smile at first, then widening, illuminating his face, especially when his gaze fell on me. When I was little, I remembered that smile, the warmth, the gentle affection that radiated from it. He had always loved me, spoiled me, treated me like a precious treasure. But now, there was something different in his eyes, something strange, indescribable. It wasn't the pure, uncomplicated gentleness I remembered from childhood. It was deeper, more attentive, intense. I pushed the unsettling feeling aside, dismissing it as the product of my own anxieties, my own disorientation in this strange new world. He was just older, I told myself. He had changed as people do over time. It was natural. There was nothing to worry about. Daisy? Sarah? Is that really you? He asked, his voice raspy with disuse, but still carrying a trace of the gentle warmth I remembered. The years had etched lines around his eyes, deepening their sockets, but the underlying kindness was still there. A flickering ember beneath the ash of time. We greeted him, our responses hesitant, unsure, overshadowed by the enormity of our sudden displacement. Grandpa, however, embraced us with an unexpected enthusiasm, his arms thin but surprisingly strong as he hugged Mom, then turned to me, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than felt comfortable, before enveloping me in a hug that smelled of mothballs and old wood, a scent that was both foreign and vaguely comforting, like a scent from a long-forgotten trunk in the attic of my memory. He ushered us into the house, his enthusiasm infectious, a bright spark in the gloom of our arrival. Inside, the house was steeped in the past, a museum of faded glory. Simple, worn furniture, dark wood polish smoothed by generations of use. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that managed to penetrate the gloom, illuminating faded floral wallpaper and time-worn rugs. It was nothing like our spacious modern house in the city. Yet, despite the age and the simplicity, there was a palpable sense of care. He had clearly been expecting us, had prepared for our arrival. He had cleaned, dusted, aired out the rooms. He led us to 2 adjoining bedrooms at the back of the house, both simply furnished but meticulously tidy, the beds neatly made with freshly laundered sheets. "For you and Daisy," he said, gesturing to the larger of the 2, a soft smile playing on his lips. "I hope it's comfortable enough. It's not much, but it's home." Not much compared to what we had lost, no. But there was a different kind of warmth here, a different kind of comfort. A quiet, understated thoughtfulness that resonated in the careful preparations he had made, in the quiet pride in his voice as he showed us around his humble abode. It wasn't luxury, but it was something. Something solid, something real, grounded in the earth and the passage of time. The early days of living with Grandpa unfolded with a surprising semblance of peace. He was attentive, solicitous, constantly checking on us, asking if we were comfortable, if we needed anything. He told stories, mostly rambling anecdotes from his youth, tales of farming and simpler times, his voice a low, comforting rumble that filled the quiet house. He helped Mom adapt to the slower pace of country life, showing her the local market, introducing her to the few neighbors who still lived nearby, offering quiet, practical assistance that slowly began to chip away at the wall of despair that had surrounded her. But as the days bled into weeks, a subtle shift began to occur. A growing unease that started as a whisper in the back of my mind and gradually amplified into a persistent hum of anxiety. It was Grandpa's eyes. His gaze. It was becoming stranger. More intense. More unsettling. Whenever I stood before the old cracked mirror in my bedroom, brushing my hair, getting ready for nothing really, since there was nowhere to go, no one to see in this isolated place, I would feel it. A prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched. And when I turned, casually at first, then with growing apprehension, I would often find him there. Standing in the doorway or at the edge of the garden, his gaze fixed on me, unblinking, unwavering. His eyes. They lingered. They scrutinized. They seemed to undress me, not physically, but in some more profound, more disturbing way. They seemed to penetrate beneath the surface, to see something more than a granddaughter. And it wasn't the warm, indulgent gaze of a loving grandfather. It was something else entirely. Something I couldn't name, but instinctively recoiled from. First, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was my clothes. In the city, I had favored comfortable, casual outfits, light dresses, simple jeans and t-shirts. Clothes that were unremarkable, blending into the anonymity of urban life. Here, in this rural setting, maybe they were out of place, too revealing, too city-like. I started to feel self-conscious about my appearance, suddenly hyper-aware of the way my clothes fit, the way my hair fell around my face. I remembered his comments, innocent enough on the surface, but now, in retrospect, laced with a subtle undertone that made my skin crawl. "You've really grown up, Lily," he had said once, using the childhood nickname only he ever used. "Just the other day I was holding you, and now you've become such a beautiful girl." Beautiful. He used that word a lot now. Beautiful. Charming. Graceful. Compliments, maybe. Grandfatherly affection, perhaps. But the way he said them, the way he looked at me when he said them, it felt different. Wrong. Uncomfortable. I tried to reassure myself, to brush aside the growing unease. It was just a difference in lifestyle, I told myself. City versus countryside. Generational differences. He hadn't seen me in years. He was just adjusting to seeing me as a young woman, rather than the child he remembered. There was probably nothing to worry about. Just my overactive imagination, fueled by stress and displacement. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger, more insistent with each passing day. The weight of his gaze, the unsettling intensity in his eyes, the subtle unspoken something in his interactions with me. It was like a discordant note in an otherwise peaceful melody, a jarring undercurrent of unease that threatened to unravel the fragile tranquility of our new life. Then one quiet noon, the unease crystallized into something more concrete, more terrifying. Mom had gone to town, a rare excursion for her, to pick up supplies and I suspected, to try and find some semblance of work in this unfamiliar place. Only Grandpa and I were home. The house was steeped in the heavy stillness of the midday heat, the air thick and drowsy. I sought refuge in the living room, sinking into the worn cushions of the old sofa, its faded floral fabric soft and surprisingly comfortable. In my hands a book, a worn paperback I had picked almost at random from the dusty shelves lining the walls, a forgotten relic from a previous generation. Outside, weak rays of sunlight filtered through the dusty window panes, illuminating a small corner of the room, casting the space in a dreamy, muted light, enhancing the sense of quiet isolation. I tried to lose myself in the pages, to escape the oppressive stillness of the house, the growing disquiet within me. But my focus wavered, the words blurring on the page, my mind drifting back to the unsettling feeling, the persistent awareness of Grandpa's presence somewhere in the house, a silent, unseen watcher. Suddenly, a soft rustle broke the heavy silence, a gentle footfall on the worn wooden floorboards behind me. My heart lurched, a sudden sharp jolt of alarm. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my senses on high alert. "Grandpa!" It was Grandpa. I knew it instinctively. He entered the room, his movements slow, deliberate, almost stealthy. He held a plate in his hand, a gleaming white porcelain plate that seemed incongruous in the faded, time-worn room. It was piled high with fruit, peeled and neatly arranged. Apples, pears, oranges, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of the room. Catching, he had called it in the story, but here now it felt almost garish. He approached slowly, silently, his eyes fixed on me, not on the fruit he carried. He placed the plate on the small table beside the sofa, the clink of china against wood echoing in the quiet room, amplifying the sudden tension that crackled in the air. He smiled, that slow, hesitant smile that no longer felt warm, no longer reassuring. "You eat," he said, his voice low, almost husky. "I just prepared it. You have to eat a lot of fruit for good health." I raised my head, forcing a smile in return, a strained, unnatural curve of my lips. "Thank you, Grandpa," I murmured, picking up a slice of apple, taking a small, reluctant bite, my eyes fixed on the book in my hand, trying to appear engrossed, trying to create a barrier, a shield against the growing unease that radiated from him. Grateful, yes, for his gesture. But the gratitude felt thin, hollow, overshadowed by the heavy weight of his presence, his unwavering gaze. He didn't leave. He didn't move on to another task, another room. Instead, he sat down in the chair opposite the sofa, settling into the worn cushions, his eyes still fixed on me. At first I thought he just wanted to sit, to rest, to enjoy the quiet afternoon. But the silence stretched, elongated, becoming heavy, oppressive. He sat there saying nothing, doing nothing, just looking at me. His gaze unwavering, unblinking, boring into me, making my skin prickle, my breath shallow. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the book, to lose myself in the words, to block out the unsettling intensity of his stare. But it was impossible. His gaze felt like a physical presence, a tangible pressure, burning the space between us, suffocating the air in the small room. After what felt like an eternity of strained silence, he spoke, his voice soft, almost breathy, breaking the suffocating stillness. "You've really grown up," he repeated, the same words, but this time they sounded different. Heavier. Laden with a new, unsettling meaning. "Just the other day I was holding you. And now you've become such a beautiful girl." I forced myself to raise my face, to meet his gaze, my smile strained, brittle. "Yes," I replied softly, my voice barely audible, my cheeks flushing with an uncomfortable heat. "Time flies so fast, Grandpa." His eyes held mine, his gaze intense, probing, no longer the warm, gentle eyes of the grandfather I remembered. They were different, indescribable. They made me feel exposed, vulnerable, uncomfortable in my own skin. He continued, his voice low, almost a murmur, as if he were contemplating something deeply personal, something he had been turning over in his mind for a long time. "The older you get, the more beautiful you become. These eyes, this face, all resemble your mother when she was young. Very beautiful. But you have your own unique features. No one can compare." Compliments. They were supposed to be compliments. But they felt wrong. Too intense. Too personal. Too something else. I shifted uncomfortably on the sofa, trying to hide the rising tide of embarrassment, of unease that was flooding my heart. "You flatter me too much, Grandpa," I mumbled, my eyes still glued to the pages of the book, pretending to read, pretending to be calm while inside, a storm of confusion and anxiety was brewing. "I'm just ordinary," he continued, oblivious or perhaps deliberately ignoring my discomfort, as if he were compelled to say these words, as if they had been building up inside him, demanding to be released. "I used to carry you around the garden," he reminisced, his voice taking on a dreamy quality, a wistful tone that sent a shiver down my spine. "Do you remember? When you were a little girl. You kept chattering to me about this and that." He paused, his gaze fixed on me, lingering too long, too intensely. "And now, in just a few years, you've become such a beautiful young woman. With such a graceful figure." Graceful figure. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, sending a fresh wave of unease washing over me. Graceful figure. Why was he talking about my figure? Why was he looking at me like that? I forced another strained smile, my heart pounding against my ribs, the book trembling slightly in my shaking hands. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice tight with awkwardness. I remember. It was so much fun back then. You always spoiled me. Spoiled you? He echoed, his voice soft, almost a caress. He continued to stare, his eyes unwavering, unblinking. You're not only beautiful, he said, his voice dropping even lower, becoming almost a whisper, but also very charming. The boys, they would surely be crazy about you. He paused, a strange, unsettling smile playing on his lips. I just wish there was someone good enough to take good care of you. My face flushed crimson, the heat spreading down my neck across my chest. Embarrassment warred with a growing sense of alarm. A prickling fear that was beginning to take root in my heart. Take good care of me? Why was he talking like this? Why was he looking at me like this? You're still young, Grandpa, I stammered, bowing my head. My hands shaking so badly now that I had to close the book to hide their trembling. It's too early to think about that. He smiled again, that unsettling, enigmatic smile. A slow, knowing curve of his lips that sent a shiver of revulsion down my spine. He looked at me for another long, silent moment, his gaze lingering, possessive, before finally standing up, the sudden movement making me flinch. Yes, he said, his voice regaining a semblance of normalcy, of grandfatherly warmth, or at least a veneer of it. You're right. Too early. Let me leave you to your reading. I'll go out to the garden for a while. With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me sitting there, frozen, relieved yet deeply disturbed. Relieved that the conversation was over, that the suffocating intensity of his gaze had finally lifted, but disturbed by everything. By his words, by his eyes, by the unsettling undercurrent of something that had permeated the entire encounter. I breathed a sigh of relief, a shaky, uneven breath that did little to calm the frantic pounding of my heart. It felt as if an invisible weight had been lifted, but in its place, a new weight had settled, heavier, more insidious, a knot of anxiety that tightened in my stomach. When he was gone, I dared to raise my head, to look around the quiet room, as if searching for answers in the faded wallpaper, in the dusty furniture, in the sunbeams slanting through the window. Everything seemed still, peaceful, ordinary. But nothing felt ordinary anymore. Something had shifted. Something had broken. Something had been irrevocably tainted. The book in my hand felt meaningless, a weight of paper and ink, devoid of any comfort, any escape. My mind was no longer focused on the lines on the page, no longer capable of absorbing words, of constructing narratives. It was dominated, consumed by Grandpa's eyes, by his words, by the unsettling compliments that echoed in my mind, replaying themselves over and over, each repetition amplifying the unease, the confusion, the nascent fear that was beginning to bloom in my heart. After that conversation, everything shifted again. The subtle unease escalating into a constant, gnawing anxiety. Grandpa's eyes, they were everywhere. Not physically, not always, but in my mind, in my peripheral vision, in the shadows of the old house. They were no longer the warm gaze of a kind old man. There was something else there now. Something possessive. Something hungry. Something that made my skin crawl and my stomach clench. Every time he was near, I felt it. The prickling sensation on my skin, the racing heartbeat, the tightening in my chest, the instinctive urge to escape, to put distance between us, to disappear. I tried to avoid him, to make myself scarce, to spend as much time as possible outside, in the overgrown garden, under the canopy of fruit trees, seeking refuge in the open air, in the illusion of space and freedom. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting. But the feeling wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, a constant, unsettling companion. I started to sleep poorly, my dreams filled with vague, shadowy figures and unsettling gazes, waking up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the weight of anxiety pressing down on me. Then one morning, Mom announced she had to go out again. Another trip to town, this time, she said, to help Dad with some important work in the city. Work that was apparently stabilizing, work that offered a glimmer of hope, a possibility of something. Anything. To escape this suffocating countryside. This oppressive house. This unsettling presence that was my grandfather. When I heard her say she was leaving, a fresh wave of unease washed over me. Colder, more potent than ever before. Although I didn't want to admit it, even to myself, I knew. Deep down in the pit of my stomach, I knew that something was terribly wrong with Grandpa. It wasn't just his eyes anymore. It was everything. His words, his actions, his very presence. There was a wrongness about him. A darkness lurking beneath the surface of his grandfatherly facade. After Mom left, the house descended into an even more oppressive silence. A suffocating stillness that amplified the fear that was growing inside me. In the past, even when Mom was out, I would still see Grandpa around, puttering in the garden or sitting in his armchair in the living room, occasionally glancing at me. But it had been fleeting, perfunctory glances easily dismissed. But today felt different. Today he seemed to want to be closer. And that closeness, the very idea of it, filled me with a paralyzing dread. That day, the third day Mom was gone, stretched out endlessly, each hour dragging by with agonizing slowness. The afternoon sun, pale and weak, slanted through the trees in the garden, casting long, distorted shadows across the overgrown grass, creating sparkling spots of light on the peeling paint of the old garden bench. I, as usual, had nowhere to go, nothing to do but sit under the fruit trees, seeking solace in the rustling leaves, in the distant chirping of birds, clutching a book in my trembling hands, a book I couldn't read, a book that offered no escape from the rising tide of fear. Grandpa's garden. It had initially seemed like a haven, a refuge from the oppressive stillness of the house. But today even the garden felt tainted. The peace, the solitude, the natural beauty, it all seemed to amplify the nervousness, the dread, the growing sense of isolation. My mind, instead of finding solace in the surroundings, was consumed by an uneasy feeling, a growing premonition of something. Something bad. Something terrifying. Something to do with Grandpa. I was trying to lose myself in the book, trying to block out the rising panic, trying to ignore the prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the feeling of being watched, when suddenly I heard it. A sound. Strange. Faint. Coming from behind me. Gentle like soft footsteps. On soft grass. My heart lurched, a violent spasm in my chest. My breath hitched in my throat. A wave of icy fear washed over me, paralyzing me, freezing me in place. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, I turned my head, my muscles stiff, resisting the movement, my eyes wide with dread. And there he was. Grandpa. Approaching. His steps slow, deliberate, silent on the soft grass but sure. Purposeful. His eyes were fixed on me, never leaving me, burning into me, pinning me in place. Anxiety, raw and visceral, clawed at my throat, suffocating me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I couldn't take my eyes off him, even though every instinct screamed at me to stand up, to run, to flee, to escape. But my feet felt rooted to the ground, heavy, leaden, unresponsive to the frantic commands of my brain. He walked closer, closer until he was only a few steps away, his shadow falling over me, engulfing me in a chilling darkness. I tried to stay calm, to project an illusion of composure, but the tension was evident, radiating from me in visible waves, distorting my features, tightening my lips, widening my eyes. Grandpa! I called out, my voice trembling, barely a whisper. A pathetic attempt to break the spell, to shatter the suffocating silence, to reassert some semblance of normalcy in this terrifying moment. He stopped right in front of me, towering over me, his shadow completely enveloping me now, blocking out the weak sunlight, plunging me into a chilling gloom. He stared down at me, his gaze different, unfamiliar, unreadable. His eyes, they were no longer just unsettling. They were predatory. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep, resonant, unfamiliar, devoid of the grandfatherly warmth, the gentle humor I vaguely remembered. It was a stranger's voice, a voice I didn't recognize, a voice that sent a shiver of pure terror down my spine. I like you, Lily. The words hung in the air between us, heavy, suffocating like a physical weight pressing down on me, stealing my breath, stealing my voice, stealing my ability to think, to react, to understand. Stunned. I was utterly stunned. My mind went blank, reeling, spinning, unable to process the simple, devastating words. I like you. From Grandpa. To me. His granddaughter. Like you. Not love. Not affection. Like. In a way that was wrong. Terribly, unspeakably wrong. He continued, his voice even low, determined, relentless, crushing any lingering hope that I had misheard, misunderstood, misinterpreted. In my life, he said, his eyes burning into mine. I have never seen a girl as beautiful as you. You are perfect. From your eyes to your skin to your smile. Perfect. Beautiful. Like. The words echoed in my mind, disconnected, disjointed, meaningless, yet terrifyingly real, impossibly wrong. I stood still, frozen, petrified, completely confused, utterly devastatingly alone. Not knowing how to react. Not knowing what to say. Not knowing how to escape. My heart was pounding against my ribs, a frantic, desperate drumbeat in the suffocating silence. My whole body was frozen, rigid, unresponsive, locked in place by an invisible force, by the sheer, unimaginable horror of what was happening. I couldn't take my eyes off him. His gaze held me captive, trapped me in its unsettling intensity. But I couldn't say a word. My tongue felt thick, clumsy, useless. My voice trapped in my throat, strangled by fear, choked by disbelief. Those words coming from his mouth, from the mouth of the grandfather I had once respected, once loved, the grandfather from my hazy childhood memories. Those words were like a cold knife, sharp and brutal, slicing through my mind, tearing through the fragile fabric of my reality, ripping apart the last vestiges of security, of safety, of normalcy. He stood there, blocking the already weak sunlight, casting me in shadow, his eyes steady, unwavering, burning with desire. Desire? For me? His granddaughter? The thought was so grotesque, so monstrous, so utterly beyond comprehension, that it threatened to shatter my sanity. I could feel his breath, hot and ragged, on my face. The closeness. It was suffocating, overwhelming, making my head spin, making my stomach churn. The closeness of a stranger, a predator, disguised in the familiar, terrifyingly corrupted form of my grandfather. You know, he continued, his voice now thick with a disturbing passion, a desperate longing that made my skin crawl. You have grown up into a beautiful young lady, and I cannot help but notice that. Still I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My feet were glued to the ground, as if rooted there by fear, paralyzed by horror. A series of chaotic thoughts, fragmented images, disjointed memories, raced through my mind, a frantic, desperate whirlwind of confusion and terror. But none of them were strong enough, coherent enough, powerful enough to help me escape, to break free from this nightmare, to shatter this terrifying delusion. I felt like I was trapped in a strange, horrifying dream, a nightmare woven from distorted memories and twisted desires, where everything was vague and scary and unbearably, suffocatingly real. After an agonizingly long silence, a silence filled with unspoken horrors, a silence that stretched and warped and threatened to swallow me whole, I finally managed to force a few words past my constricted throat, my voice trembling, weak, barely audible, but determined. Determined to break free, to push back against this monstrous reality, to reclaim some semblance of control, some sliver of sanity. You shouldn't say that, I stammered, the words catching in my throat, choked with fear and revulsion. He continued to move closer, step by agonizing step, until he was so close that I could feel his breath on my cheek, see the tiny red veins spiderwebbing across the whites of his eyes, smell the stale, musty odor of old age emanating from his pores. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, echoing in the suffocating silence. My feet remained glued to the ground, unresponsive, betraying me, trapping me in this terrifying proximity. When he stood directly in front of me, his shadow completely engulfing me, his face inches from mine, his skinny, gnarled hand, trembling slightly, slowly, deliberately reached up, hovering for an agonizing moment in the air between us, before finally closing around my hand, his rough, dry fingers wrapping around mine, enclosing my small hand in a grip that was surprisingly strong, surprisingly insistent. I shivered, a violent tremor that ran through my entire body, a visceral reaction of revulsion, of horror. The feeling of his rough skin touching mine, the unexpected strength of his grip, the predatory intensity in his eyes, it all combined to unleash a wave of pure, unadulterated terror that washed over me, threatening to drown me, to shatter my already fragile composure. His voice, now a hoarse whisper, a guttural murmur that resonated deep in my bones, whispered, vague, yet also heavy, laden with unspoken meaning, with unspeakable desire. Lily, he breathed, my childhood nickname, now twisted, corrupted, made monstrous by the context, by the horror of this moment. Lily, do you know? I want you. He squeezed my hand, his grip tightening, his fingers digging into my skin, and in his eyes I saw it. Not the gentle affection of a grandfather, but an emotion I had never expected, never imagined, never wanted to see reflected in his gaze. Desire. Raw, naked, terrifying desire. I want you to be mine. Panic erupted, a blinding, searing, white-hot terror that consumed me, obliterating all rational thought, leaving only pure, instinctual fear. I panicked, flailing inwardly, desperately trying to pull my hand back, to break free from his grasp, from his presence, from this nightmare. But I didn't have enough strength. His grip was too tight. My limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, weighed down by fear, by shock, by disbelief. My mind was spinning, a vortex of chaotic thoughts, desperate pleas, frantic prayers, searching for a way out, a way to escape, a way to survive this terrifying encounter. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, every scrap of remaining willpower, I managed to force words past my constricted throat, my voice trembling, weak, barely audible, but still determined. Determined to resist. Determined to survive. Determined to break free. Grandpa, I spoke up, my voice shaking, cracking, but with a fragile core of resolution. Grandpa, you shouldn't do that. He looked at me, his face momentarily registering surprise, confusion, and then disappointment. Disappointment? That I was resisting his advances? That I was recoiling from his desire? The absurdity of it, the monstrous perversion of it, made my stomach churn with nausea. But do you know? He stammered, his voice faltering, momentarily losing its predatory intensity, replaced by a flicker of confusion? Self-pity? I've been thinking about this for a long time. He gestured vaguely, helplessly, as if trying to explain the inexplicable, to justify the unjustifiable. You've grown up, become a beautiful woman, and I just want to be with you, protect you, love you. Like I've never loved anyone before. Love? He dared to use that word. To corrupt it, to defile it, to twist it into this grotesque parody of affection, this monstrous expression of selfish desire. The word felt like a physical assault, a slap in the face, a violation of everything sacred, everything decent, everything human. I took a step back, stumbling, losing my balance on the uneven ground, my hand still trapped in his vice-like grip, my body trembling violently, uncontrollably. Grandpa, I repeated, my voice stronger now, fueled by desperation, by revulsion, by a primal instinct for self-preservation. Grandpa, I can't. I'm your granddaughter. We can't be like this. Please stop. He fell silent, his face shifting, morphing, contorting in a confusing display of emotions. The predatory intensity in his eyes flickered, wavered, replaced by something else. Something softer. Something weaker. Something defeated. Longing, yes, was still there, but now overlaid with a different emotion. A distant sadness. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he let go of my hand. His grip loosened, his fingers uncurling, releasing me from his grasp, freeing my hand, but not freeing me from the horror of the moment, from the indelible stain of his words, his gaze, his touch. He stepped back, putting distance between us, a physical space that did little to alleviate the suffocating closeness, the suffocating horror of what had just transpired. He bowed his head, his shoulders slumping, his body seeming to shrink in on itself, his voice drowning in a sudden wave of guilt, or at least the appearance of it. I'm sorry, he mumbled, his voice barely audible, choked with shame or perhaps just regret at being thwarted, at being rejected. I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what happened to me. He looked at me one last time, his eyes now filled with a strange, unsettling mixture of regret, longing, and something else. Something calculating? Something unresolved? It was hard to decipher, impossible to understand. Then, quietly, without another word, without another glance, he turned and walked away, his thin, hunched figure disappearing slowly, silently, behind the dense foliage of the fruit trees, vanishing into the shadows of the garden. I stood still, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to think. My heart was still beating frantically, a wild, erratic rhythm, fear still echoing in every breath, every pulse, every fiber of my being. Terror, confusion, revulsion, disbelief, shame, disgust. A maelstrom of conflicting emotions raged within me, threatening to tear me apart, to shatter me completely. When he was gone, finally, truly gone, when his figure had completely disappeared behind the trees, when the silence of the garden returned, heavier, more oppressive than ever before, I dared to breathe. A sigh of relief, shaky, uneven, desperate, escaping my lips as if I had just been freed from a suffocating nightmare. From that day on, everything changed. Again. But this time the change was internal, profound, irreparable. I no longer dared to face him. Every time he appeared in my sight, in the doorway of a room, at the edge of the garden, in the periphery of my vision, I recoiled instinctively, viscerally, trying to avoid him, to escape his presence, his gaze, his very existence. I felt confused, lost, adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. Scared, yes, terrified of him, of his gaze, of his touch, of his words, of the monstrous desire he had revealed. Not knowing what to do. Not knowing who to turn to. Not knowing whether I should tell Mom, whether she would believe me, whether she would understand, whether telling her would make things better or worse or simply different. Different in a way I couldn't even begin to imagine, couldn't even begin to comprehend. But I also felt something else. Something unexpected. Something complicated. I also felt the distance growing between us, between me and him, between the granddaughter I was and the monstrous figure he had revealed himself to be. And in my heart, amidst the fear and revulsion, there was also worry. Worry for him. Worry for us. Worry for what we had lost, for what we could never reclaim. Fortunately, mercifully, not long after my parents returned, Mom walked into the house one afternoon, her face illuminated by a gentle smile, a flicker of hope in her eyes that I hadn't seen in weeks. She said that everything in the city had been resolved. Vague, undefined, but somehow hopeful. Dad's work, whatever that work was now, had stabilized. Another vague term, another ambiguous promise, but we could return home. Home. The city house. The spacious house filled with sunlight and laughter. The house we had lost. The house we were somehow miraculously getting back. A wave of relief so intense it almost buckled my knees washed over me. Everything seemed to lift, the crushing weight on my chest easing, the suffocating anxiety receding, the ever-present fear receding, diminishing, becoming manageable. I no longer had to be afraid of Grandpa. Not in the same way. Not in that visceral, gut-wrenching, paralyzing way. Escape was in sight. Salvation was at hand. Freedom was coming. Dad returned shortly after Mom, his smile brighter, more genuine than I had seen in weeks, his voice regaining a semblance of its old confidence as he announced that everything was back to normal. Normal. Another word that felt strange, distorted, almost meaningless in the context of everything that had happened. But normal was coming back. Our old life, or something close to it, was being salvaged from the wreckage. And that for now was enough. The whole family, Mom, Dad, and me, we began to prepare to leave Grandpa's house, to return to the city, to reclaim our former life, or some pale imitation of it. I felt a mixture of emotions, a confusing, contradictory blend of relief, elation, sadness, guilt. Relief to be leaving this oppressive place, to be escaping the suffocating presence of my grandfather, to be returning to some semblance of normalcy. Elation at the prospect of reclaiming our old life, of returning to familiar surroundings, to a sense of security and comfort that had been shattered and then, miraculously restored. But also sadness. A deep, unsettling sadness. For Grandpa. For what had happened. For what we had lost and gained and lost again. I would never forget those days. The days in the old house, the days under the oppressive weight of Grandpa's gaze. The days when everything, from his eyes to his actions, had changed our relationship forever, irrevocably, tragically. But now it was over. Or almost over. As I got into the car, settling into the familiar seat beside Mom, the car laden once again with boxes and suitcases, but this time filled with a different kind of weight, a weight of relief, of hope, of escape. As we prepared to leave, to drive away from the old house, from the overgrown garden, from the silent figure of my grandfather, I felt safe. And grateful. Grateful that everything was finally almost over. As we were getting into the car, I accidentally, involuntarily caught Grandpa's eyes. He was standing a little distance away, near the edge of the garden, watching us, his figure still and silent, a lonely sentinel in the fading sunlight. His gaze, it was sad, deep, unfathomable, as if he was trying to say something important, something profound, something regretful. But he couldn't get the words out. Or wouldn't. Or dared not. He didn't dare look me straight in the eye. His gaze flickered, wavered, dipped away, avoiding mine, filled with a mixture of shame, guilt, and longing. Longing for what? For me? For the past? For something he had lost, something he could never reclaim? He just stood there, motionless, silent, a little distance away, quietly observing, a lonely figure in the vast, overgrown garden, a relic of a past I was desperately trying to escape. And I didn't have the courage to face him. Not after everything that had happened. Not after the horror, the confusion, the revulsion, the shame. Not after the irreparable damage that had been done to our relationship, to our fragile family. I had so many mixed emotions churning inside me. A turbulent, chaotic sea of conflicting feelings. Fear, yes, still a lingering undercurrent. A faint tremor of unease that refused to be completely extinguished. Worry for myself, for Mom, for our future, for the fragile normalcy we were trying to rebuild. But also a little sympathy, pity, for him. For Grandpa. For the lonely, broken old man he had become. I knew that even though he was wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong, he probably felt regretful. Lost. Alone. And that, in its own twisted way, was sad. Still, I couldn't forget those tense moments. The horror of his confession, the terror of his touch, the chilling intensity of his gaze. Everything was so sudden, so confusing, so deeply, irrevocably wrong, that the relationship between him and I, between granddaughter and grandfather, was no longer the same, could never be the same again. We both needed time. Time to heal. Time to process. Time to try to make sense of the senseless. Time to heal the emotional wounds, if healing was even possible. And perhaps someday, in some distant, unimaginable future, to heal this broken relationship, if it could ever be the same again. But I doubted it. Deeply. Profoundly. Irreversibly. The car started, the engine sputtering to life, breaking the heavy silence of the garden, shattering the oppressive stillness of the countryside. I looked out the window at Grandpa again one last time. He stood there alone in the middle of the large, overgrown yard, his silver hair gently swaying in the breeze, a lonely sentinel against the backdrop of the fading sunlight, a solitary figure silhouetted against the encroaching shadows. I could feel the loneliness radiating from him, a palpable aura of isolation and despair. He had lived alone here for so long, and now we were leaving him to return to that silence, to that solitude, to that loneliness once more. As we pulled away, leaving him standing there alone, fading into the distance, I sighed a long, heavy sigh, filled with guilt, with sadness, with a profound sense of loss. No matter what he had done, no matter how terribly wrong he had been, no matter how deeply he had violated my trust, my innocence, my sense of safety, he was still my relative. My grandfather. The grandfather I had once loved, once respected, once trusted. But now there was a distance between us, a chasm of fear and revulsion and irreparable damage, a distance that neither of us knew how to overcome, how to bridge, how to even begin to heal. The car rolled forward, gaining momentum, gradually leaving the old house, the overgrown garden, the silent figure of my grandfather, fading into the rearview mirror, becoming smaller, more distant, more unreal. I turned my head to look ahead, focusing on the road stretching out before us, trying to push away the chaotic emotions swirling in my heart, trying to escape the suffocating weight of memory, trying to outrun the shadow of fear that still clung to me, refusing to be shaken off. On the way back, to the city, to our old life, to whatever semblance of normalcy we could reclaim, I didn't say a word. Mom sat next to me, her smile strained, fragile, her eyes still holding a trace of worry, but she was trying to be cheerful, trying to be strong, trying to be. Mom. She asked me gently about the past few days, about Grandpa, about the countryside, about everything. But I only answered hastily, vaguely, dismissively. My responses short, clipped, uninformative. Then I lapsed back into silence, turning my face to the window, staring out at the passing scenery, the blur of trees, the rush of cars, the endless expanse of asphalt. The scenery on both sides of the road flashed by in a dizzying, meaningless rush, but in my mind, there was only one image. The image of my grandfather, standing silently in the garden, his eyes sad, haunting, unforgettable, forever etched into the deepest recesses of my memory. A memory that would forever be tainted by fear, by confusion, by the unspeakable horror of what had almost happened, of what could have happened, of what, in some profound, irreparable way, had already happened, leaving an indelible scar on my soul, on my life, on my family. We returned to the city, to our house, to our old life, or the ghost of it. Things slowly, tentatively began to fall back into place. Dad went back to work, Mom resumed teaching. I started my senior year of high school, pretending to be normal, pretending to be okay, pretending that nothing had fundamentally shifted, nothing had irrevocably broken. But underneath the facade of normalcy, the cracks remained, deep and unhealed. The unspoken trauma of the countryside, of the old house, of Grandpa's eyes, hung between us, a silent, invisible barrier, a constant, suffocating presence. We never spoke of it. Not to each other. Not to anyone. It became the unspoken secret that haunted our family, a ghost in the house, a shadow in our lives, a wound that refused to heal, a memory that refused to fade. And I was left to navigate the wreckage, to pick up the pieces, to try and rebuild a life that had been irrevocably shattered, a life that would never, could never be the same again. The question lingered, unspoken, unanswerable, a constant, gnawing presence in the back of my mind. Would I ever truly escape the shadow of the old house, the weight of Grandpa's gaze, the haunting echo of his whispered confession? Or would I forever be trapped, bound to that terrifying memory, forever marked by the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface of my grandfather's seemingly gentle smile? Only time and perhaps therapy would tell. This story, while fictional, touches on a deeply disturbing and, unfortunately, sometimes real violation of trust and familial boundaries. Daisy's experience is a chilling exploration of the vulnerability and confusion a young person can feel when confronted with such inappropriate advances from someone they should be able to trust completely. The story highlights the importance of listening to your gut feeling, of recognizing and respecting personal boundaries, and of finding the courage to speak up when something feels wrong, even when it involves family. Silence, as Daisy rightly concludes, can be incredibly damaging. If Daisy's story resonated with you, if you found yourself feeling her fear and confusion, please let me know in the comments below. Your thoughts and reactions are important. And if you'd like to explore what happens next, if you want to see how Daisy navigates the aftermath of this traumatic experience, how she begins to heal and rebuild her life, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment requesting part 2. Your engagement will determine if we continue Daisy's journey.